Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee, which is taking place at County Hall in Glenfield, though some officers will be joining us online via Microsoft Teams. I would like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council website and will also be available for viewing after the meeting. Can everyone make sure they please switch their microphone on when they're speaking and then turn it off when they're finished speaking? I have received apologies from Mr. Bannister, Mr. Richardson, with Mrs. Page acting as his substitute, and Mr. Orson with Mr. Merry acting as substitute. And thank you for the substitutes for coming forward. I propose that the minutes of the item 1, I propose the minutes of the meeting held on the 23rd of July 2021 are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is everybody agreeable to that? Thank you. Item 2, I've received no questions from the members of the public. Item 3, I have no questions from members. Item 4, to advise any other item which the chair decides to take as an urgent item elsewhere. There are no urgent items. Does any member have any declarations of interest they wish to make in respect of item on today's agenda? No, there are no declarations of interest. So the first item on today's agenda is regarding the appointment of an external auditor, as set out on pages 11 to 18. The report is fairly clear. We have with us today Nick Walsh, Head of Finance, who is going to present this item. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just before I start on the report, I just wanted to update the committee on the 2020-21 audit. The results of the external audit of LCC's accounts and its pension fund were due to be on the agenda for today's meeting. The audit is almost complete, but it is taking slightly longer to complete than we'd originally hoped. The increased regulation on auditors following the Redmond review and other reviews of external audit, and also additional work as a result of the change in the council's accounting system partway through the last financial year, have added to the complexity of the audit this year. As it stands, no significant issues have been raised so far, but once a firm date is confirmed for the completion of the audit, a separate meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee will be convened to consider the auditor's findings. It's expected to be hopefully at some point at the end of November, early December, when we can have that meeting. It is just worth pointing out that from a technical perspective, the statutory publication date of the final audit was the 30th of September. But we'd already agreed with Grant Thornton that due to the new system and the additional requirements coming through from Redmond, that it was appropriate to set a more realistic timetable of the 5th of November, and a note was put on our website to say that it would be deferred, and that note will obviously stay up there until we actually formally sign off the accounts. Shall I pause there in case anyone has got any questions on that before I go on to the report?
I think that's everybody understands and accepts that, and we will have another meeting to approve the accounts. Yeah,
we will.
That's fine.
That will be set up. Yeah,
thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to the report. The report advises the arrangements for appointing external auditors for the financial years from 2023-24. So following the closure of the Audit Commission and since the 2018-19 audits, local authorities have been able to decide its arrangement for appointing external auditors in accordance with the relevant legislation, which is set out in paragraph 4 of the report. In 2016, the LCC opted into the public sector audit appointments arrangements, and under those arrangements, Grant Thornton were appointed for our external auditor until the financial years 2018, from 2018-19 to 2022-23. At that time, of the 493 eligible public bodies, 484 opted into the sector-led scheme, obviously because they saw the benefits of doing so. A new appointment is needed for the financial year 23-24, and that will be expected then to be that year and a further 5 years after that. In September this year, the PSAA formally invited all local government bodies to join the second appointment process, and we require to make a response by 11th of March next year. And the regulation requires that this decision is taken by a meeting of the County Council. But obviously bringing it through Corporate Governance Committee first is the appropriate route. So there are three options to choose from. Option one is that we make a standalone appointment ourselves outside of the PSAA framework. This would require us to create a separate auditor panel consisting of a majority of independent members. Option two is that we set up a joint auditor panel with other authorities. And option three is to join PSAA again. This report explains the advantages and disadvantages of each option. There are problems in the current audit market which have led to delays in the completion of many audits this year. Redmond Review reported on how local government audit is an unattractive market for audit firms and individual auditors to operate within. So the market for this service is limited at present, and only 8 of the larger auditing firms have the accreditation, experience and sort of specialist staff really to undertake this work. And these firms would be much more likely to bid for work through a larger procurement framework than seek work from 1 or 2 isolated authorities or groups of authorities. So it is recommended that we pursue option 3, as this provides the maximum opportunity to limit the extent of any increases in costs entered into a large-scale collective procurement arrangement, and also would remove the costs of having to establish an auditor panel. So, the committee is asked to consider the options set out in this report, and if in agreement with the recommendations, to recommend to the County Council to approve option 3, i.e. to opt into the sector-led body national scheme led by PSAA for local auditor appointments. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. We have a couple of questions. So, Mr. Bolter.
Thank you. Can you just go over the terms of the contract again? Because you said something can then be extended for another 5 years. Is it for a 3-year period and then it could be extended, or?
Yeah, it's potentially up to 5 years that we could appoint them for. But yes, we could terminate it after 3 years. I think that's right. So it's up to 5 years.
I'm a bit concerned about long-term contracts, Chair, with auditors. I mean, 3 years is reasonable. 5 years, I think, is stretching things a bit too much. How local government is today, it's perhaps a bit too much, but I'm happy to accept option 3 as an option.
Mr. Bill.
I'll second that proposition, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got no problem with option 3 because it's the most sensible option. But how does that, where is the process where the members' involvement comes in? Does it still get reported to this body? And, you know, is that still the same process, or does it follow a different option? Thank you.
Yes, this committee would be notified of the outcome of that procurement. Obviously, the procurement will be undertaken through the council's sort of standard procurement operations in line with the regulations set out in the procurement framework itself, and then reported back to this committee the outcome of it.
And so will subsequent audit reports?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. So the committee is asked to consider the options set out in the report, as Nicola said, to recommend to the County Council approval of option 3 to opt into the sector-led body national scheme for local auditor appointments. It makes a lot of sense because we could be struggling to actually find an auditor if we don't do this. So I'm happy to recommend this, and could I have a seconder? Thank you. Thanks very much. Can I take it this is agreed? There's nobody against that. Yeah, so it's agreed. All right, so all in favour. Thanks very much. So the next item is the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman Annual Review 2021 and 2020-21, and an update on the complaints and freedom of information as set out on pages 19 to 58 of the agenda pack. We have with us this morning Simon Parsons, Corporate Complaints and Information Services Manager, who will present this report. So, Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So this report's in three parts, really, and I'll start with an overview of the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman's annual review letter, which we receive every July and sets out the complaints that have escalated to the Ombudsman during the year. So in 2020-21, 52 complaints or inquiries were opened by the Ombudsman, and that's a significant decrease to the previous year, but important to note, probably not directly comparable this year. And the reason for that is the Ombudsman paused their casework for an entire quarter from April to June in the year. So understandably, volumes of new cases would be impacted by that. On Appendix C and on page 53 of your papers shows some benchmarking against our statistical neighbours with regards to complaints that escalate to the Ombudsman, and this shows relatively good performance per 100,000 residents, placing us 5th out of the 16th in that sector. So fairly healthy in terms of escalation rates to the Ombudsman. 58 decisions were made during the year, with 19 detailed investigations conducted. The remaining 39 were dealt with at the assessment stage, which is generally where an ombudsman will consider whether or not, firstly, it's in their jurisdiction at all, and there may be issues why they can't consider it. And secondly, are they likely to find any fault on the face of the evidence they've got? So quite a high volume are being looked at that initial assessment stage. Of the 19 detailed investigations carried out, 13 had a finding of some fault, 68% of them. That's a slight decrease, and again places us firmly mid-range in terms of statistical neighbours, and just slightly under the average for all county councils. In one instance, the Ombudsman was entirely satisfied with the actions taken in remedying fault, which is a new indicator that they report on. That always appears very low, that figure, so 8% of the overall total. But it's important to note that there's a couple of things that affect that, and it's just worth just giving some context around that. That indicator will only be met if the Ombudsman both accepts that the conclusions reached by the council and accepts the amount that the remedy offered, usually by the council. So in some instance, there may be no issues around the council's response, or indeed that they felt it appropriate to make a compensatory offer, and it may be as simple as a difference between the level of money being offered. So in one case this year, a difference between 200, the Ombudsman felt it should be 300. Took us outside of that. So I just want to kind of note that indicator. It for complaints managers, it causes us some concerns. I'm not sure it's the best methodology they use at the moment on that. 2 public reports have been issued this year, and that's really the first time we've had public reports for a number of years now. It is an increasing trend from the Ombudsman to issue public reports. They issued 40 this year, which is generally year on year up. Both those public reports have been to Corporate Governance Committee through the year for the details behind them. Both were children and education kind of complaints, and again within the Ombudsman's annual review of complaints handling, that kind of mirrors the likelihood of public reports being in that area, with 40% of the public reports being issued on children's and education services. So that's the details are in the papers around those specific cases. Overall financial compensation remedies were down slightly in the year, with 24,000 approximately. 3 cases resulted in payments over 5,000, and these were approved by the chair of corporate governance in line with our level policy in that area. Turning to complaints more generally, sort of part B of the report, which is really just talks about the general picture. There was a 21% increase, so fairly significant increase in overall numbers of corporate complaints during the year, so a total of 527. And what's really driving that? Some significant increases in both transport-related complaints, SEN transport, some significant increase in waste management, primarily around the changes that the pandemic pressures put on waste sites in terms of both the need for booking systems and the changes in customer experience on the day with longer wait times, things like that, all generating some complaints. Other areas remained largely stable. Really, those two were the kind of key increases there. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there's been some pressures through the year on response time scales, but overall those remain fairly healthy, with 77% of those corporate complaints responded to in 20 working days, and just 15 that exceeded our policy maximum in that area. So still fairly low levels that are drifting outside of that. In terms of adult social care complaints, the volumes there were almost identical to the year before, so 196 as opposed to 194. That bucks the national trend a bit, where that area is increasing in adult social care. So we're slightly ahead of the curve in that area. Again, similar pressures on response times, but importantly, less in that area going to the Ombudsman. So I think what we're seeing the benefit certainly in adult social care, and hopefully starting to see the benefit in the corporate complaints area, is the benefit of the review step that we put in a couple of years back, which is really just improving the kind of the discipline, the belt and braces, and just ensuring that we've got really senior oversight of any case before it goes to the Ombudsman, so that we're giving ourselves every opportunity of making sure that we're not presenting cases that have obvious weaknesses in them for the Ombudsman to scrutinise. I think that's really been a real positive development in the last couple of years. Children's social care, those volumes again are relatively stable. The main change really this year is perhaps the mixture, with more being considered under our own corporate policy rather than the statutory policy. That really follows fresh guidance issued by the Ombudsman about 18 months ago. That's actually quite helpful in the sense of it helps reduce the spend on independent investigators, which I've set out in the report on page 27. So starting to see a reduction in the amount that the costs incurred on those independent investigations. From the ones considered through the statutory process, 63 complaints were accepted. Of those, 7 escalated to the second stage, so the independent investigation stage. So pretty good levels of resolution at first stage, just 11% escalating, and a further 3 going on to review panels and 2 going on to the Ombudsman. In terms of just general improvements to complaints handling, I guess the main things to note, we paused our training offer to departmental managers through the COVID pandemic pressures. Really, the main challenge there is that course really lends itself to an in-person experience, and there's a lot of casework on that. It's planned to restart in the 2022 year, so we'll be delivering that and rolling that out to particularly all the new managers that have come into post in that ensuing area. Some issues with retention in the complaints and information team. Again, volume pressures. Generally, it can be quite a difficult area to work. We took steps this year to reevaluate those roles, and that's helped with keeping that maintenance in there. And again, it's one to keep an eye on that volume increase, which, if it continues that level, may cause some pressures within the team, but at the moment is sustainable. The last part of the report is around freedom of information and environmental information regulations management. This is quite a very positive picture, really, in this area. Some really good discipline in terms of managing these. 883 requests received, so a slight decrease on the previous year. Again, the main reason for that was the first quarter, so at the height of the pandemic pressures, where I think the public probably eased off on kind of those kind of levels of approaching businesses with inevitable pressure. So a real significant reduction in that first quarter, picked up to usual levels since then. 839 of those have been were responded to the year. So obviously numbers are slightly different because some were received before the start of the year, with the bulk of them being in the freedom of information area. We responded to the majority of those. So 70% of those were we provided all the information requested. So reassures around good levels of transparency going on in that area. Only 69 were refused in their entirety, and by far the majority of those, the reason for the refusal was the cost of retrieving that data. So by far the majority, 51 of those 69 were refused on the grounds of over the reasonable limit of 18 hours to collate that and respond to that information request. The main area to look at in terms of the statutory legislation there is around the compliance within 20 working days, which the Act sets out, and 86% of the requests were responded to within that timescale. Given the wider pressures on authorities through that year, that's very healthy performance, and certainly compares very favourably to other authorities in that area. 9 internal reviews were considered during the year. That's where we get challenges to decisions of either the information released or the exemption applied. Of those, 5 were upheld, showing again that process is effective in looking at that with a fresh pair of eyes, considering it fairly, and just 2 escalated to the Information Commissioner's Office, with just 1 finding of fault during the year. And again, that was purely around the timescale of responding to a complaint rather than the decision making itself. I think that is all of the things I wanted to kind of cover off in this report, but very happy to take any questions on any of that.
Thanks very much. It's time for a comprehensive report there. So does anyone have any questions or comments on this? Mr. Walter.
Thank you. Yes. A bit concerned about 2 public reports, but you say they are getting down to doing that more frequently now. Case 9, the care provider not giving consistent and timely care. That concerns me because, you know, we do owe our elderly residents a duty of care. So I assume this care provider has been spoken to by officers, and I don't know whether they've won on the new contract or not, but I'd have thought that that was quite a serious complaint against the care provider, and it would be looked into. And would they perhaps not be allowed to tender for the next lot of work?
Yeah, I can certainly say that in response to that one, we have a compliance and quality monitoring team within adult social care who work with providers around that, and certainly we have taken steps to, on the back of that, increase monitoring around their general performance. I don't know the details of whether that will specifically play an impact in terms of future tendering in that area. I haven't got the details on that, but certainly I can certainly say that an audit of other cases, other residents that were receiving care from that provider was certainly carried out. We certainly covered off due diligence around that, and I believe we also sought to claw back the money from the provider in that instance as well, which is a clause in the contracts that with providers now that gives us options to look at clawback where these sort of things take place.
Thank you. Mr. Cross, I think you wanted to comment on this.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good morning, members, and apologies that I'm actually attending remotely. It's just really, if I may, an observation with regard to Simon's report, very important report, with regard to FOIA requests and the fact that behind every FOIA request, there's often quite a lot of work done involving legal services colleagues in terms of advising on the elements of the request that possibly are not FOIA compliant. And I think it's also right to say that the Council goes to a long way to try and accommodate requests, to try and make them respondable to. They do take quite a bit of time and effort, and obviously Simon also is right to mention the 18 hours, the time limit, which might seem a lot, but in fact can be eaten up quite rapidly with regard to reviewing old files, getting them back from off-site, etc. It's just really an observation, but I thought I'd like members to be aware of the work that goes behind the scenes with regard to FOI requests, and indeed advice given to Simon with regard to Ombudsman complaints as well, to try and ensure that the council is doing the right thing and can improve and learn. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Cross. Mr. Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report. And I know it's to do with an update on improvements to the complaints procedure and complaints handling. But and it's my first time at this committee, but I have a question, well, two questions. I've gone through it, checked all the stats out. There's been a slight decrease here, an increase there. We're stable there. We're booking the trend there. So what's happening behind the scenes when we get all these complaints in to prevent them happening again? What's being done? And if that's for another committee, I'll take your advice on that, Chair. But it's a great report, but there's not much in it about what's being done to reduce the complaints. Thank you.
Simon, if I can ask you to respond.
Okay, so the in terms of detail of some of those areas, so I mentioned a couple through the report around SEN transport, around waste. So there's a couple of areas, there's a couple of things to kind of reassure members around how we use that data. So as well as this overarching report, which kind of looks at predominantly at quite a high level, there's obviously a more detailed corporate complaints report that goes to the Scrutiny Commission earlier in the year, and indeed the two social care complaints reports go into the respective scrutiny and overview committees, where those more detail is provided around some of those specific areas and for discussions. In addition to that, I go every quarter to each of the key departments, and I say the key ones because of where the volume of complaints generate. So environment and transport, children and family services, and adults and communities, and talk to their senior leadership teams around emerging themes. So that's really the we don't wait for the annual report. If I know there's a pressing problem, so for example, in the year we're currently in, I know there's a pressing problem, for example, around backlogs around financial assessments, things like that. So that's already tabled at the relevant senior leadership teams for them to be looking at those and working through those problems and fixing things. In addition to that, obviously, behind all of the Ombudsman reports, behind a lot of the other reports, the departments are asked to kind of to look at action plans around that, to understand what went wrong, what can we do differently around that, and my team track as responses come in, where we can kind of look at very obvious actions that are already taken place in the responses. So we track that through and report that data around how well are we doing around not just resolving the individual issue, but grasping some of that learning that potentially stops this happening again. And that's a journey we're on where we'd like to increase that further. We're up to about sort of 30–40% where it's very obvious in complaint responses going out that the investigating manager has put in other steps that will prevent the problem happening again. And that's been gradually increasing year on year. In some instances, they are just one-off errors. Sometimes it's very closely linked to policy decisions. So the learning's not in the same vein around other stuff. But where possible, we kind of look at that and try and grasp the nettle. Is this something about our procedures or around how we're applying our policy or staff guidance and whatever, and look to kind of try and make sure that is being considered. So and where we just don't see evidence of that, again, that's fed into the senior leadership teams for them to consider how we can do better at that.
Thanks very much. That's pretty reassuring. So we investigate and learn from any complaints, which is exactly as it should be. Have we got any other comments or questions? No, we haven't. So can I take the report as noted and that all comments made will now be captured in the minutes in the usual way? I'll take that as agreed. Thank you. We now move on to item 8, the revised members' code of conduct and protocol on the members' officers' relations, are set out on pages 57 to 98 of the agenda pack. Anthony Cross, Head of Law and Deputy Monitoring Officer, is going to present this item, and he is on Microsoft Teams this morning and on the main screen.
Thank you, Chair. And again, good morning, members. And I send first off apologies from Lauren, who unfortunately is a bit stricken with COVID. So as you've said, I'm attending in my capacity as Deputy Monitoring Officer. It's perhaps timely to have a report before you today with regard to standards, given what's happening in Westminster. But I would like to start off and reassure members that standards in terms of code of conduct issues within the county are very good and very well respected, as you will know and other members will know for the reports you get with regard to code of conduct breaches. They are in the minority, which is always pleasing. This report is an important report because standards are important and they help you and indeed officers do the very valuable job that we all do in terms of providing services to Leicestershire residents. The key issue that I would like to draw out from the report, which is a comprehensive report, is the fact that this was the subject of a cross-party workshop on the 6th of October. So it's had implementation of all members on the council. And the plan is, with regard to these revisions, is that it will be a common code of conduct that will apply to all members at district councils in the county as well as the county as well. Try and ease any tensions to allow for clarity and understanding. But there will be some local tweaks. The important thing I would emphasise is that although this is not going to come in effect, subject to approval by full council in December to the next municipal year, so that's the first next year, both Lauren and I would like to encourage all members to get familiar with the new code now, so that when it comes into operation, it won't be too much of a shock. Though I should say the changes are not that great if you look at them, and they're appended as Appendix A, and the report also summarises the changes. As ever, some changes in terminology, which I'm sure we will all get used to in time. It's perhaps also that I emphasise that obviously there will be training in the new code in readiness for its in operation, in readiness for it becoming operable next year, and that will be done as part of the training that we run in April and May. Chair, I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions, but I would like to commend the report to you. I'd also like to add that the second aspect of the report is also a very important matter, and that's the protocol on member-officer relations. The council's work depends on a good professional working relationship between its officers and you as members, and that code gives clarity about what is and is not possible or permissible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Cross. So, in honesty, a lot of it is common sense, and the report is very clear. But does anyone have any comments or questions? Mr. Bill.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
Right. Yes, it is fairly common sense, but we've debated this many times. It's still got no teeth. At the end of the day, all these things can be carried out, but the council's got no teeth against any member. So that's the bit that concerns me. Keep discussing all this, but at the end of the day, we go back to the fact that it's got no teeth. We can't do anything.
I can't disagree. It's Parliament who has to, I'll be guided by Mr. Cross, but it's Parliament who has to pass the legislation to do that. Mr. Cross.
Well, of course, Chair, that's right. And Mr. Bolton, I think, reflects the concern that I think both officers have and indeed members, that this does need, to make it work, it does need some stronger teeth, but that will require primary legislation. And I know strong representations are being made and continue to be made for something to be done. It's to be hoped that the new Secretary of State may address this, but no mention so far of any proposed legislation. I would just say that in terms of my experience, that the teeth that there are is when matters get publicised. At the end of the day, it then is not good publicity, and that will always impact in terms more on the member and the member's party rather than indeed the authority.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Cross. So, right, Mr. Burns.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, this is, as you say, all common sense, but I find it extraordinary that, having reached this time of life, we're now being told to act with integrity and honesty, act lawfully, and treat all persons fairly and with respect. How on earth do the authors of these sort of reports believe we've actually survived as human beings for this length of time? Some of these principles were ingrained in us at primary school with my parents. We learned how to behave properly, how to treat people with respect. These things are just part of our DNA, I would have thought, as human beings which want to get on with each other. But if now we've reached this time of life, we have to be told all over again, that's fine. But I don't think there's anything very new here. Of course, we treat everybody with respect. And of course, we treat officers with respect, and they treat us with respect. This is just a way of life which we wouldn't even consider coming away from. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. It is your comments are certainly taken on board, and I very much hope everybody in Leicestershire County Council would act in that way, and I think they probably will. It's not always the case in other areas. Mr. Clarkson.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I'd like to move the recommendations, Chairman, on page 64, both A and B, Chairman.
Thanks very much. So we've got another. Oh, Mrs. Page.
Yes, thank you. We are where we are, and I found it very amusing when a member of the public approached me some time ago and said I wanted to complain about my MP, and I took it as far as possible and was told, well, the only chance I've got is to put my cross in another box. And I always think when I'm having subjected to be, a signing up, that it seems to be very one-sided. But anyway, in regards of somewhere in this, and I flicked through, I can't find it now, it says to encourage parish councils and town councils. And I was wondering how we could effectively do this, because I'm finding in all my years, I'm struggling to get my parish councils to sign up. But for instance, somewhere in here, because I can't flick, like I said, it refers, Anthony, to not using their personal emails, etc., etc. So how can we actually actively encourage parish councils to also adhere to some of, and I'm not talking about the integrity one, but the more salient things set without this code now? Thank you.
Thanks very much. As I understand it, within the report, there is a recommendation that if we have uniformity between the district and county councils, and of course they have their own governance arrangements, but common sense would dictate, and it is hoped that they will across the board adopt the revised. And I think the monitoring officers are talking to each other, but I'll be guided again by Mr. Cross, if you could answer that.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mrs. Page, for the question. The good news, I think, from the County Council, quite frankly, is that it is the district councils that provide the support and encouragement to the parish councils with regard to what they should do with regard to standards. And sadly, there are a number of issues, I'm not aware of any particularly great ones in Leicestershire, but there are nationally, where parish councils do seem to have quite a lot of problems because of local issues, and then strong personalities makes it quite difficult. And I perhaps won't say any more than that, but other than to say that really it's incumbent upon us all in the local government world, whatever tier we're in, to encourage good practice. As indeed Mr. Bill was saying, it is something that's really should be ingrained. and people that come to volunteer to help out, especially at parish council level, do sometimes perhaps experience the frustration about decision making and the bureaucracy involved, which can sometimes lead to try and cut corners or put pressure on people, that then starts to cause standards issues within the parish council, which has to be investigated by the district council. It is a difficult issue. It is a matter for our district colleagues, but I think we can all do what we can to help and assist. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. No more questions or comments. So moving to the recommendations then, which are set out on page 64 of the agenda pack. Regarding a recommendation A, the committee is asked to recommend that the County Council approve the adoption of the revised codes of conduct for members as set out in Appendix A to the report. I'm happy to move it. Could I have a seconder? Thank you. So can I take that this is agreed and there's no dissent? Yeah. Okay, regarding the recommendation B, the committee is asked to recommend that the County Council approves the adoption of the revised protocol on member-officer relationships as set out in Appendix B to the report. Again, I'm happy to move this recommendation. Can I have a seconder? Thank you. So is that agreed by everybody? There's no dissent. Yep, so I take that as agreed. We now move on to item 9, the risk management update is set out on pages 99 to 124 of the agenda pack. Neil Jones, Head of Internal Audit and Assurance, will present this item. So over to you, please, Neil.
Thank you, Chair, and morning, everyone. So agenda item 9 is the routine report providing members with movements in and updates on corporate risks. We have some details of emerging risks of issues this time around, some information on renewing the council's insurances, and also our regular updates on work in train to counter the risk of fraud. So I think my first reference is starting in paragraph 5, really, which is referring across to the appendix A, which is at page 107 to 121. I will, of course, come back to take any questions on those at the end of the report. In terms of the other areas there, you can see in paragraph 5, there is some movement, quite a lot of movement in risks. It's been quite a while, obviously, since we last had a committee, so there's been opportunity to refresh some of the risks. And so, although no new specific risks have been added to the register, 3 have been removed, but will continue to be monitored in the department risk registers. 2 have been removed and subsequently merged into 1, and then the description of the Freeport risk has been amended. Moving on, in terms of the emerging risks and issues now. So paragraph 6 through to 9 provides some information on emerging risks and issues. Firstly, the potential risk around the industrial action that could be due to an impasse reached between employers and trade unions over the annual pay award. And I've mentioned there that information has been provided on how that risk is planned to be managed. Then starting paragraph 8 is some information on how our business continuity team has gathered information from departments on risks and issues that emerged during the recent spate of fuel shortages, which led to panic buying and other issues around labour and supplies shortages. So these were captured and fed across to our resilience planning group to plan for the prevention of operational impact. And finally, in this section, I refer to the exercise undertaken pretty much at the same time, really, to create a log of key business systems so that any quick decisions can be made by management on restoring priority systems should a major incident occur. The next section mentions the council's insurances. This is section 10 onwards. So we've just renewed our insurance covers for the year, and I thought it was just important to mention to members that how difficult it is in the public sector at the moment, the public sector insurance market. There's examples here. It's actually what they call a hard market, and they reckon it's as hardest as it's been in the last 20 years, both in terms of the classes of insurance, the sectors, and by loss history. The capacity in the market to insure public sector is shrinking. From my perspective, there's probably only 2 major insurers that would write across all of the county council's classes, so we'd have to have bits and bobs all over. So to keep costs low on this particular renewal, we work with our broker and the insurers, and also taking account of remembering that every time we take out insurance policy, we're penalised by a 12% tax on top of that. So we took decisions to effectively increase the levels of our self-insurance across a number of what they call the casualty covers, so public and employers liability and fidelity, which is theft and etc. So what that's meant is that we are subject now to more risk in terms of we will have to pay more cost if up to a next band level. So it really does underline the importance of robust risk management across all services. The final part of the report, starting on paragraph 16, just outlines further work being conducted to mitigate the risk of fraud. So the first part talks about a review of outputs from the latest National Fraud Initiative, the data matching exercise, and that's also almost concluded. So the type of data matches that relate to the council are shown in Appendix B, with some explanation that sometimes matches are false positives and there might be good reason for them. This section of the report also mentioned that it's approaching that exciting time of the year for counter-fraud and auditing staff with the International Fraud Awareness Week, and a number of promotions are planned. And finally, there's a reminder that frauds are becoming ever more sophisticated, and we're constantly raising awareness is fundamental to mitigating the risk of frauds as being successful. That's the end of my report, so I'll be willing to take any questions about the report content or any of the appendices.
Thank you, Neil. A very comprehensive report. So, a couple of questions. So, Mr. Walter.
Thanks, Chair. Yes. Interesting as always. Item 18. Pensions paid when people have died. Are we going to get some follow-up on that? And the report says that they've got to pay the money back.
To the committee?
Yes.
Yes, I can report that. Yeah.
All right.
It's January, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other one is perhaps more important than all. On page 107, we've got this problem where people in the care industry have got to do the COVID testing by November the 11th, which is next week. Well, failing that, they lose their jobs. Now, we have a problem in this county with care homes. They've privatised them all. We put people in those care homes. How sure are we that these companies are still viable if this staff are removed from them to put our people in? You know, I'm sure that would have been a major risk, and according to the risk register, it's not. But I view that as a major risk. There's 60,000 people going to lose their jobs on November the 11th, according to the list. Yeah. I can't believe that none of those people actually work in our care homes.
Sorry, Mr. Bolter, I did anticipate you may ask around that. So I took a view from the director yesterday, and he's still of the opinion that we are on target to be quite successful in getting that vaccination programme completed. So I know Mike's in the room. Do you want to? Mike Sands is in the room, conveniently.
Yeah, I mean, just to agree with what Neil was saying. So, because the vaccination is supposed to be double jab by November the 11th. If I've got it right, I think we were down to 1 or 2 red rated care homes within the county, that adult social care rated. So there was basically, they've done a hell of a lot of work to encourage vaccination in the local staff and working with the providers to put in place mitigation. So what started out at the, when you had to have your first dose by a certain date in September to have the gap to then do November the 11th. And at that stage, I think there was a significant number that were either amber or red rated, but it's come right down. So although it's a very large number of people nationally, locally, it's not to say it's not an issue, because workforce is a big issue for adult social care anyway, but the immediate risk of there being no staff in place on November the 12th is very, very low, which is great. Yeah.
So a follow on that, Chair. That's fine for the care homes. Okay. What about people going in the community? What about those care workers? Because that's the biggest risk. We're moving people from care homes to the community. So that's the next stage, as far as I can see.
Yeah, I'd have to look that one up. So dom care again is a risk anyway. I must admit I haven't got the detail on where we're at to with the domiciliary care provision jabs, but I'm not aware of there being anything when we've done the COVID meetings this week, you know, CMG, RPGs, all the resilient stuff. Again, there's nothing coming out of adult social care to suggest the system will collapse on Friday of next week as it would be.
Last question, Chair. Have we got a plan B in case it does?
That would be one for the Director of Adult Social Care rather than me. So unless you've got something, Neil. Just in terms of the stats on dom care and care homes, and again, we can update via the minutes of the meeting exactly where we are. Won't take me long to find them, but I will look them up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bolter. Those questions, I think, hopefully everybody is going to have their vaccination and be grateful for it. So, have we got any? Yes, Mr. Murray.
Thank you, Chair. My question is on the appendix you've got on page 107. It's a technical question. I work in risk management, more health and safety than this type of stuff, but I couldn't understand what your scoring is. Your current risk score for the first item is 20. What matrix are you using? Is it a 5 by 5 and how do you get to that score of 20? And what does that 20 mean to me as a score?
I can provide you the real detail behind this, but in terms of explanation for now, so we have a proper framework to designate our risk scoring in terms of criteria that we follow. So effectively, a risk score of 20 is high, very high on our. That's why it's in front of this domain here today. So, department. I'll just go through it very quickly. So, departments score the risks using the same framework with a consistent framework. They apply the framework and the criteria. If it reaches a score of 15, so 5.3 or 3.5, so that's 5 in terms of impact, or 3 in terms of likelihood. Yeah. So if it reaches 15, excuse me. It gets escalated into the domain, into this committee reporting system here now. So I think the easiest way to describe how it's high, that's why it's here. The earlier part of the report shows that we do take things off because the risk has either gone away or we've managed it down. I think if I just provide you the information, it may give you some. But what I was going to say was in January, we'll be refreshing the whole of the framework and the policy and bringing that back again for ratification by the committee.
Yeah, very briefly. That's great. But when we get these reports days in advance, it would be helpful if we had the framework attached. This is not my normal committee. So a very quick explanation of how you get to the score. When I do my risk reports for my business, we have the matrix at the end of the spreadsheet saying how you get to the score, and then you've got red, amber, green. So this would be red because it's high, and an explanation. So what have you multiplied to get to this 20? You've got 2 things you've used, A and B, to get to C. What is the A and B to get to C? If that was attached to the end of this spreadsheet, it would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of been around the houses on this, haven't we, in terms of what we bring to the committee. It might be, I don't know whether we're happy with links that would take it direct to, rather than additional papers.
Yeah, I think.
But I'll try and work on something that's like a refresher to people, just a simple 1-pager or something like that might be. Yeah.
That'd be helpful. Thanks very much. Thank you, Nick.
Okay, thank you.
So, any other questions? Right, Mr. Bill.
I can't find the reference now, but there's a reference here to the risk if the Freeport bid is rejected. Is there a similar consideration being given to cutting back of or scrapping of HS2 and the other capital schemes that we were hoping would be approved? These are all, this is major infrastructure, which is meant to be of benefit and certainly cost the county council millions in terms of hundreds of thousands anyway in terms of investigation and research. Is this all taken into account somewhere?
Thank you. Neil.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bill. Yes, I can't remember which committee it was, but probably June or July, I'm sure. HS2 was brought as an emerging risk, so I could send the details to you on that. So emerging risks they're just bubbling under. Not quite sure, how long it's going to. It's again in the department. It's sort of bubbling under because it's so far away. So it's not deemed big enough to make it through into the process into here. I'm unaware of which other project you're referring to. Is it?
I think there's a whole string of projects, isn't there? There's road and rail improvements which have been listed and presented in various documents.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering whether any of them are going to come to fruition, and if they don't, where does it leave us?
Yeah, the whole issue around infrastructure is part of what we've tried to incorporate this time around. So they've looked at the risk were sort of similar and merge them into a major infrastructure risk. But but I think the Freeport itself stands alone in terms of the what's going on generally within the county. I'm guessing you're thinking of major road developments like Melton and things like that. So that would be captured in the combined risk that's in the register now. The HS2, as I say, never made it or hasn't made it through yet, and Freeport's in there as a specific.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the questions. So have we got any more questions? We don't appear to have any other questions. So moving to the recommendations, and which are set out on pages 105 of the report. Regarding the recommendation, you're asked to note the report. Recommendations set out on the page are regarding recommendation A, the committee is asked to approve the current state of the strategic risk register facing the county council. I am happy to move this recommendation. Can I have a seconder? Thank you. Can I take this as agreed if there's no dissent? Regarding the recommendation B, can I take it that all comments made, which there's been quite a few, will be captured in the minutes in the usual way? Okay, with regard to recommendation C, can I take these updates as being duly noted? Agreed, I take that as agreed. Okay, so we now move on to item 10, which is the clinical governance annual report as set out on pages 125 to 142 of the agenda pack. We have with us Mike Sandys and Fiona Grant remotely. Mike Sandys is going to present the report. So over to you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So actually brief words from me before I hand over to Fiona. As the paper says, purpose of this report is to update the committee on our procedures and processes around clinical governance. Clinical governance, as paragraph 4 says, is basically we have a responsibility through our for sort of patient quality and patient safety issues in relation to our more clinical services, notably the ones that we commission from the NHS around sexual health and substance misuse, etc. So it is a chance to introduce Fiona. Some members of the committee who've been on before might remember for many years it was Mike McHugh who had the consultant leading my team for health protection, mental health and clinical governance, and reported to the committee in years past. Fiona, you probably know because she's now been with us for 20 odd months, I would imagine, but you'll know her from some of the all-member briefings that we did last year on COVID, because obviously it was Fiona's lot in life to join us the week that we had the first COVID case in Leicestershire. So she has been rather busy dealing with the biggest public health crisis in 100 years since then. But in between times when she's not been busy doing that, she has been working on clinical governance. So it's a chance for her to go through our clinical governance processes and key incidents. So over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Mike. And good morning. So as Mike has outlined, this is actually the first report on clinical governance we've been able to provide to the committee since 2019. So because of COVID pressures in 2020, we weren't actually able to provide a report at that time. So in terms of the background, as Mike has alluded, it's a requirement of the public health grant that we make sure that robust processes are in place in terms of the clinical services that we commission. And we have a number of processes in place that are outlined within the report to make sure that everything is done that should be done in line with expectations. So clinical governance is essentially about a system of maintaining quality and safety in terms of clinical services. And there are some definitions within the document that you will see. So it's often described as a framework through which organisations are accountable for continually improving the quality of their services and safeguarding and standards of care by creating an environment in which excellence in clinical care will flourish. And clinical governance refers directly to clinical services. So it is, as it says on the tin, it's essentially about those services that will include doctors, nurses and other health professionals largely. And the key services that we commission in respect to particularly that would come under this category are the substance misuse treatment services, sexual health services, NHS health checks, which are commissioned from local GPs, and the 0 to 19 Healthy Together service, which is the service that includes, for example, school nurses and health visitors that you'll probably be aware of. We also have an in-house community infection prevention and control service that we include to a degree under this category. So essentially, it's a range of services that are provided via largely the NHS, but also voluntary and the private sector. And the clinical, the sort of processes we have in place, some of them are fairly ad hoc, but mostly they're quite routine processes that we have in place largely as part of the contractual process. And examples, and I've moved down to point 8 now, examples of the kinds of indicators and the processes that we would look at to make sure that we have robust processes in place include, for example, reports of serious incidents, general patient feedback, for example, service user feedback. It includes quality visits, so our team will take usually around sort of annually, we'll take annual quality visits, site visits to where some of these services are delivered, and also clinical audits. And another key area, for example, is around staff training and capacity. So a number of different areas that we look at, and you'll see further detail of that within the document further down. So just sort of moving on from that, so in terms of the actual processes that we have in place, largely as a public health department, so within the team we have strategic leads who are responsible for each of these service areas, and they will each have a consultant lead as well who has overview over the work that's done in respect of this. And then obviously above that is Mike as Director of Public Health and myself as the consultant with the clinical governance lead. We've recently put in place a clinical governance group across the department as well to make sure we have got sort of robustness and consistency across the team. And then also moving on to point 12, one of the key sort of aspects of our assurance is that we provide a clinical governance report into the public health DMT on each of these service areas on a quarterly basis. So that's quite a detailed report, which is largely informed by a report from the provider themselves and obviously added to make sure that we can scrutinise as a DMT any issues that need to be addressed. It's fair to say that because of COVID and COVID pressures, all of those reports and all of those processes couldn't quite be continued throughout the COVID period, but we have reinstated everything now, so it is all back up and running, and so everything is in place that should be. Moving on to point 14, just to highlight that the planned quality site visits that take place and some of the clinical audits that take place also feed into DMT as part of that sort of internal public health scrutiny process. So in addition to feeding into DMT, there are regular lead member briefings to make sure any key issues are identified. And the DMT also reports obviously into committees such as this one, the Corporate Governance Committee, but also into scrutiny committees and safeguarding boards. In addition to that, you can see from the diagram outlined at point 18, there are a number of other areas that we feed into, so you can see that represented diagrammatically. And we also work closely with external key stakeholders. So, for example, Leicester City, we work closely with because we jointly commission some of the services. So if, for example, there was a serious incident in relation to that affected someone residing within the county council, we would still be very focused on that, but we would work jointly with the city council around addressing it where it's a jointly commissioned service. Additional support is also available through the local clinical commissioning group. So we would be working closely with them on some overlapping areas where we've got a joint interest, and there's a memorandum of understanding in place to help us to make sure that that happens in the appropriate way. Moving down to Table 1. So Table 1 really provides a summary of the sort of significant areas of work, significant issues that have been considered over the last 2-year period that we're talking about. And it just includes in a little bit more detail some examples of the sort of areas that we tend to focus on as part of the clinical governance programme of work. So again, So it includes some of the detail around some of the quality visits that have taken place. It talks about some of the clinical audits that have taken place. So, for example, I think, as I mentioned, a clinical audit will tend to take place on a particular aspect of a service on an annual basis. We usually pick one thing, but you can see listed on the table the number of different areas that have been looked at as part of that clinical audit process. And that's really important because clinical audit enables us to effectively assess whether services are actually delivering in line with best practice, in line with expectations. It's quite important in terms of making sure the appropriate level of clinical quality and clinical best practice is being implemented and embedded. Just moving to some of the other key areas within the document, serious incidents, I think I mentioned already. Obviously, serious incidents are deemed to be a serious incident report will be developed in situations where perhaps there is a death or where there is a particularly adverse situation, or sometimes where there's potentially a very harmful situation which hasn't actually occurred, but there is a lot of learning to be taken from that situation. And so often, if a serious incident takes place, we are notified by the provider involved, and we work closely with the provider through the contractual process to make sure that learning is taken on board and that appropriate measures are put in place as a result of that. And you'll probably see from the report that we've had lower levels of serious incidents reported in the last year compared to the previous one. So we only had 16 reported in the last year, and prior to that we had 33. It's difficult to know what the reason for that is, but we obviously suspect some of it is due to fewer services providing face-to-face interventions, and also the wider situation where there are perhaps less opportunities for incidents to take place because of the lockdown situation. You will also read from the report that the vast majority of serious incidents that were reported were related to substance misuse services. This is not unusual, and we know that when some work has been done to compare this with serious incidents that take place in other parts of the country, this is similar to the national picture. So usually it would be substance misuse services which unfortunately tend to be more likely to be susceptible to having serious incidents. So moving on to, I suppose, the other key area just to flag up that's been a particular issue because of COVID has been business continuity. So there has been quite a bit of work around making sure that business continuity arrangements are in place with services, and that particularly during the COVID period that a level of service and a level of quality has been maintained for service users. It's also worth mentioning that the Care Quality Commission, that many of you will be aware of, is the independent regulator for clinical health and social care systems. And so the CQC will also conduct regular monitoring and regular visits of the services that we also commission. And so we are party to the reports and the outcomes of CQC visits, and we incorporate that into our findings and any action that we take as a result of those. And Table 2 sets out the serious incidents that have taken place and have been responded to during the period that we're talking about. And as I mentioned, there have been fewer serious incidents this year, but the particular focus really has been on trying to make sure that in terms of substance misuse services, that we are responding appropriately to the level of serious incidents that we're having there. And just to reassure the committee that we get very detailed reports every time there is a serious incident from the substance misuse provider, and that in order to try to tackle that high incidence of serious incidents, we have reinstigated a panel around deaths related to drug and alcohol, just to make sure that actually we have got a robust process in place. And not only can we review deaths that are identified where individuals have been in contact with substance misuse services, but it's also an opportunity to review deaths where individuals have unfortunately died as a result of drugs and alcohol but haven't been in contact with those services. And I think they were the main points that I wanted to raise with the committee, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Fiona, for the report. Does anyone have any comments? Mr. Bill.
Sorry, that was a very thorough report. Yes, very, very welcome. There was a reference there, Fiona, to the CQC, Care Quality Commission, and my colleagues, Bill, raised care homes earlier on. Could I ask, are we in the loop, as it were, when the CQC visits care homes in the private sector and flag up concerns which should worry all of us, because we've had a spate of closures of care homes where the CQC had undertaken a visit earlier on, and quite clearly the CQC's recommendations were not followed up, and this has led to a sort of downhill slope, and in the end the care home is closed. Now, this is far more than just a commercial consideration for all of us. These are elderly people who are our residents, who I would have thought have suffered during this process. Is this general trend picked up anywhere, and is there any input from ourselves as county councillors or county council, yourselves as officers, to monitor what's happening and to make some attempt to address this issue?
I'm going to ask Mike Sands.
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer is, I mean, this report covers kind of the CQC in relation to its activities with our NHS commission services that public health are responsible for. Bit like the previous question, I mean, in terms of how we link with CQC around care homes, it would be a question for the Director of Adult Social Care. I could say, I'm sure John, and colleagues in adult social care will be well aware of the CQC visits, but rather than sort of bluff an answer, I think it's best described as it would be a question for a future committee.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Can I just follow up, Chair? So, yeah, I was thinking exactly the same as Mike there, but there was a sort of reference earlier on in the complaints report that Simon Parsons led on, where we mentioned a provider that had been serious complaints around, and he referred to the adults compliance team, which I am aware of, and I don't know like Mike, I don't know the full workings of it, but I know there's a team set up that would be certainly know about the closures and the CQC responses, but for a more detailed response you'd need the department to refer on that.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks both, and thanks Fiona. Have we got any other questions? Mike?
Not questions, just a couple of points to follow on from Fiona's report. One of which is, hopefully it sets out the kind of assurance processes. If I was just reflecting back on a few years ago, I think it's when Mr. Richardson was in the chair, we used to have a separate clinical governance committee drawn of officers from across the council. And I think that the challenge from Corporate Governance Committee then was this looked like a sort of duplication of stuff that we should be doing as business as usual, which was a fair challenge. So with Fiona's input, where we've set out, hopefully, I suppose the point I want to put out is hopefully it comes across that we're much more joined up and that clinical governance isn't a standalone. It is something that kind of fits in quite strongly with our contract management procedures, the quality visits that we do. So I'd have to go back to the old paper and find out exactly what we used to do. But to my mind, I do think that instead of having a separate committee that did its own thing, actually having the contract managers working with Fiona and her team, then feeding in through our departmental management team meetings and keeping the lead member informed is probably finally got much more in line with where the Corporate Governance Committee, what they were asking for going back a few years. The other thing to touch on in table 2, just to draw out, because even the 16 serious incidents look quite scary, should say sort of directly really, because it's meeting a public record. It's the nature really of the cohort of people who've got serious drug and alcohol issues that however good the service might be, you inevitably will get a number of people who die in treatment. So I wouldn't want that to be seen as a sign of poor quality services. It's unfortunately the nature of the clientele.
Thank you, Mike. I think there certainly is, reading the report, a huge amount of scrutiny goes on. Rosita.
Yeah, can I just ask an ignorance question, please? Under sexual health, there is levonorgestrel and ulipristal mentioned. What are they and why are they mentioned? Just satisfy my ignorance and curiosity. Thank you.
Do you want me to try and take that one, Mike?
Yeah, go on then.
Yeah, so I was going to say I would need to go back to my the contract lead for that particular programme to be able to tell you exactly what it is, but they are all treatments that are required as part of the sexual health services, which I suppose is what it says on the tin, but I would need to go back and get more detail on exactly what it is.
I'm going to have a guess at this, isn't levonorgestrel, isn't that the morning after pill? From memory, and that's the clinical governance bit, is just making certain we've got the PGDs for that in place, I think. Does that sound about right?
Good guess. Good guess. No, it's just my curiosity and my ignorance, because I couldn't figure out why it was there, what it meant and what effect it had. So never mind.
I think Go on.
Sorry, Mike. No, I was going to say the reason they're there is because they've been identified. So they're all sort of particular processes or treatments within each of those services. And the reason they're there is because they've been identified just to make sure that the processes that are followed by our service are absolutely in line with best practice. So there'll be sort of a best practice protocol that they will be audited against to make sure that they're delivering exactly in the way that they should be, and that the service we are providing is in line with up-to-date latest best clinical practice. Does that help?
Yes, they're medication, and you have to follow a costly medication, and a proper process for administration has to be followed.
I
Absolutely.
am convinced it's the morning after the pill. And the point being, you can go to a pharmacy to get it. You don't need to go to the doctor. So we need to have the PGD, which sets out the appropriate protocol for a non-doctor to dispense it. That's right.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I think we've all learned something this morning. So if there are no other questions or comments, the committee is asked to note the report. Can I take it that we're happy to do that? That's all agreed. Thank you. So moving on, thank you, Mike, and Fiona, much appreciated. I'm sure after the last 20 months, it feels as though you've been with us 20 years, but appreciate the report. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we now move on to item 11, which is the internal audit plan and progress report as set out on pages 143 to 166 of the agenda pack. So Neil, it's over to you again.
Yes, thanks, Chair. So this report provides information on planned and delivered internal audit work, the current resource position in the service, and also a section on work that the public sector accounting body, SIPFA, is undertaking that relates to both internal audit and audit committees. If we start really at the July committee, I introduced the concept of 6-month internal audit planning, explained it was to allow resource allocation to be a little bit more dynamic in being targeted towards current risks and issues. So paragraph 6 explains that since its introduction, unfortunately, progressing audits has been slower than I'd hoped for. This has primarily been due to quite high levels of unplanned sickness with our own team suffering COVID. And also we've had a period of summer where people just wanted to get out on leave, and we can understand that, both in terms of the auditors and the clients. And then also, unfortunately, we suffered some quite experienced staff leaving, so we do have some vacancies. So just for assurance, I mean, the recruitment of replacements is underway. We spoke earlier on, Chair, it is difficult. It's a difficult market to recruit qualified good staff. So we are going to have to use the agency in order to keep the workflow going, so I can provide an opinion at the end of the year. Paragraph 7 is also resource related, and it explains that earlier this week I actually appointed a further audit manager, and what this will do, it'll alleviate some of the pressures on my own role, allowing me a sort of strategic and professional role than has become of late. So paragraph 8 explains that I recently reviewed the plan of work with the assistance of the Director of Corporate Resources, and we revised it to take account of any new priorities in the period ending next March. The updated list and the rationale for postponing some audits is explained in Appendix 1. And that list is probably already difficult to achieve with the continuing vacancies, so it's probably a little bit out of date, or even as we speak now. So we'll keep on revising that and refreshing that. The next section, paragraphs 10 to 15, explains the type of work undertaken by internal audit staff in the 4-month period. So this is more relevant to, more historically in terms of what the committee had received. And that work is in Appendix 2 on page 153. We then move on to the next stage of the report, which is paragraph 16 onwards, and that refers to the final appendix, really, which is on page 161, which shows the movements in progressing high importance recommendations, which are in the committee's domain. So paragraph 17C, it's quite pleasing to note that there has been good progress over this the summer cycle in closing off some of the long-standing recommendations. Then we're moving on to the sort of final part of the report, and it starting in paragraph 18 to 20 really, and this is some work that's been undertaken by the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, which is CIPFA, and it relates to the role of internal audit and audit committees in the public sector. So this included the completion of a survey. I am pleased to say the survey was supported by and completed by the chair of the committee and the director of corporate resources, as well as myself. So CIPFA will report back on the nationwide findings on that early next year. And then starting paragraph 19, really, I've been bringing a number of reports over the last couple of years to corporate governance on the impact of the Redmond review and other changes there. So it's moved on now, so that the government was responding with proposals to the Redmond recommendations. Excuse me. And what they've put forward, their proposals, and CIPFA has pretty much related to audit committees. CIPFA has pretty much supported every one of them, which is quite interesting. They are a prominent body, so it'd be interesting to see whether audit committees are ramped up in terms of their responsibilities and in terms of their status in the local authority. So that will be reported back in due course. Finally, Chair, I agreed with you before the meeting. It's not in the report because it happened after I drafted the report. But again, I mentioned over the last couple of years, I've not only brought Redmond reports, but changes to what they call the National Audit Code of Practices is by our external auditors. And again, it's slightly linked to Redmond in that with all the failings in various local authorities over the years, starting with Northamptonshire and others, and now ending up currently with Slough, there are the Code of Audit Practice was rewritten, and there was a real focus to make the what they call the value for money opinion, the conclusion by the external auditor, to be far more focused and a narrative. So I've been talking about that for a while, and our own external auditor, Grant Thornton, a separate team to the team that Nick alluded to earlier on doing the actual closure of the accounts, that the Grant Thornton have been chosen to develop this work over the years with the National Audit Office. So I just think this level of scrutiny will only increase. And the way it ended was that last Friday I spent a good deal of time going through with an auditor from Grant Thornton the processes for audit, governance and risk management at the County Council, and also the work of this committee. And I just wanted to bring to the committee's attention that the auditor commented in a very positive manner, and especially around the level of challenge that she denoted in from members in the minutes. So I think I just would be, brought that back to the committee. I hope it's going to be reflected in a report now, having brought it here. But she was quite keen to get that over to me, and so I did invite her to tune in today to watch or on the catch up. So that's the end of my report really. So I'm just wondering whether members have any questions about either the report itself or any of the content in the detail of the appendices.
Thank you very much, Neil. Some reassurance around the financial robustness. There's certainly members are kept very advised of where we are financially, and hopefully we will avoid any situation as has occurred in Slough. Mr. Bolter.
Thank you, Chair. Neil. Disappointed that 2 staff members have left. That's disappointing. Any idea when, I know you say you're recruiting, but any idea when those posts might be filled? Permanent staff rather than agency? That's the first one. The second one is, I'm pleased to see the direct payments audits now closed after our threat at the last meeting. Seem to have worked. And one does concern me. Climate change and carbon emissions, request to move, it's on Appendix 1. I'd actually like to enlighten on that one, if you would.
I will do. Thanks. Oh, still switch on. Yeah. So the post we did about a month ago. We put an advert out and through the normal authorities recruitment portal. and I think we only had about six or seven responses, including somebody in Saudi Arabia who'd obviously, wanted to work mobile and flexible from there. But we had a couple of internal applicants, and we're holding those back in terms of, there will be, pushed through to interview. Nevertheless, we wanted to trawl the market a little bit further, so we've gone to the professions now, to the Institute of Internal Auditors and SIPFA. So there's an advert already out now, so that will be closed within the next 3 weeks. So I'm hoping next side of Christmas, for the January committee, I'm hopeful that we will have a full staff complement back up. I mentioned earlier on, it's a very difficult market to recruit into, to get the right people to hit the ground running. And you're absolutely right, Mr. Bolter. The two staff who left, and it was only on the basis that they wanted to do something else, really. We tried to keep them, but couldn't. The direct payments audit is closed, correct? There is reference there, though, to say that we went through in a lot of detail to make sure that was closed, and they gave us a lot of information in terms of their control processes that they redeveloped. So it's sort of refreshed, really, and redeveloped. So there is a reference in there. We're going to do some more further testing after Christmas, and again we'll report back to the committee in January. And then the climate change, it's a sensible change. There's been an appointment into our chief exec's department to drive forward the governance arrangements on this. The lady's only just become employed, so we're waiting for her to get sort of embedded for a while, and then we're going to pick that up. But across the board, everybody recognises that climate change specifically is, a high risk across the board. Chris Tombini has asked me to concentrate on the governance arrangements and those moving forward, so there'll be an element of work on that.
Will that come back to this committee, Chair?
Yeah. I mean, everything that is in that rolling plan either gets work done, or if it's taken off, I'll give a rationale to why it's taken off, so you get the opportunity to ask me why, as you have done. But that believe you me, that is high up there to move it forward.
Yeah. Okay, so we will get reports. All right, happy with that? Yeah. Okay. So if there are no other questions, the committee is asked to note the contents of the routine update report. Can I take it as noted? Yeah, everybody's agreed. So finally, we move on to item 12, which is the quarterly Treasury Management Report as set out on pages 167 to 74 of the agenda pack. Nick Walsh is going to present this item, so over to you, Nick.
Thank you again, Chair. So this report comments on the position of and including the second quarter of the 2021-22 financial year. The key sort of economic factors relevant to our financial position are covered in paragraphs 6 to 9 of the report, and there is more detail in the appendix. There is now a major shift in tone in relation to inflation. So previously the view that the Bank of England were taking was that high inflation levels were likely to be short term. However, the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee now suggests it's more likely to be sustained over a longer period. So this has seen markets start to price in an interest rate rise within the next few months. Whether that materialises or not is not clear, but the longer term impact at the end of the longer term impact of the end of the job retention scheme will take a while to filter through. So as that data emerges, that will have an impact one way or another. Members might have noted yesterday that the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee voted to keep rates the same, obviously at the moment, but the vote was 7-2, and there was certainly some suggestions there that a consideration will be perhaps in the new year that it will be going up. So the slightly higher rates that we're now starting to available have a marginal impact going forwards, but it obviously won't be significant until it moves quite a long way up, and I don't think that's likely in the short term at all. So moving on to paragraphs 10 to 15, that section. £163 million worth of loans matured during that period. average rate of 0.18%, and 187 million of new loans were placed at an average rate of 0.14%. And that leaves the overall portfolio balance at nearly 370 million. And you can see the breakdown of that and where that money sits in the table in paragraph 14. Also, a further 1.4 million of private debt investment was received back during the quarter. So in total, this means we've had 7.6 million returned of the original 20 million investment at this point in time. And in addition to that, we've had 2 million received in relation to interest. So the internal rate of return on our private debt is currently looking at about just under 4.6%. And whilst the private debt represents a sort of fairly small proportion of the overall Treasury management portfolio, it does raise the overall annual percentage return from 0.17% on the loans only basis to 0.32% overall. So it is having a positive impact, but obviously private debt is slightly more risky and it ties up money for longer periods of time, so we can't be certain. So our liquidity suffers as we put money into it from that point of view. Moving on to the paragraph starting at paragraph 16. Here I just need to draw the committee's attention to the downward rating on Helleber Bank or Landesbank, which means that Link's lending duration, their assessment of the appropriate lending duration was reduced from 6 months, reduced to 6 months, sorry, from 12 months. And also the lending limit was reduced from 20 million down to 10 million. So at the point of the downgrade, we had 20 million placed with them. 10 million of this has actually now been returned, and the remaining 10 million is due back next week. So risks are low. But although the loans were compliant at the time they were placed, the limits were breached following the downgrade. But that sort of turn of events is unavoidable, really, because we can never predict what's going to happen going forwards. And obviously we rely very heavily on Link's assessment of what is an appropriate lending term and amount in order to sort of make our decisions. But because of that breach, we do need to draw the committee's attention to it. And then almost finally, paragraph 17 and 18. This is really just to make the committee aware of the possibility in the near future that we are likely to increase our amount of investment in private debt, given the positive returns on these investments. Any decisions that are made on this will be taken within stated policy and will be limited to 40 million, which was in accordance with the Cabinet's approval that we received back from December 2017. And in fact, as we do make the decision to go into this, we would seek Cabinet's further approval anyway, given the timeline, the 4-year gap from when that approval was originally given. So that's just as a sort of heads up, really, of a likely change in the future. And then finally, just on the paragraph 19, the interest on investments earned at the end of the financial year, currently we are estimating to be of the order 2.8 million. This is quite a bit above the budgeted figure of 1.3 million, but that is primarily due to the earlier than expected income distribution from the private debt investments that I mentioned earlier. That's all I was going to say.
Okay, that sounds quite positive. Does anyone have any comments or questions on the Treasury Management Report? No? So the committee is asked to note the report. Can I take it as noted? Yeah, lovely. Thank you. So we now move to the date of the future meetings. Please note the dates of future meetings in 2022, which is Friday the 28th of January, Friday the 13th of May, Friday the 23rd of September, and Monday the 21st of November. Item 14, any other items which the chair has decided to take as urgent? We have no other items. So thank you for attending today's meeting, and I now declare the meeting closed. Thanks very much, members and officers.
Thank you.